she said. I got nowhere to go, Cowboy said. You've got me, and that's enough. The sun poured down like warm honey across the red-dusted desert floor, stretching long shadows from the Sangre Dristo Mountains, New Mexico territory. 1870. The wind carried the dry scent of earth and that faint, bitter edge of too many rainless days. In the middle of a cracked, empty creek bed, Catherine Zane drew her horse to a halt, her pale gray eyes fixed on a figure staggering forward. Her dress was heavy with grit, boots worn thin, hair tangled, as if she'd crossed through an entire season of sandstorms. But what made him slow his horse wasn't the weariness in her frame. It was the way she walked. No glancing over her shoulder, no panic in her stride, just the steady steps of someone leaving behind a nightmare whose roads she knew all too well. He swung down from the saddle, moving slow, removing his hat to let the hot wind comb through his hair. Her voice cracked as her gaze met his. I got nowhere to go, she whispered. The words, rough, scraped thin, no questions, no conditions. His answer came deep and steady, like the earth beneath their feet. You've got me now, and that's enough. For a moment, her eyes trembled, as if they wanted to believe him. Then her knees gave way. He stepped forward, just in time, catching her before she could fall, letting her full weight rest against him. Dust rose around them, drifting through the late-day light like the desert itself had been holding its breath. And in the rush of wind and her uneven breathing, his arms only tightened quietly, promising himself he would never let go. Part 1. Trust in Silence. Catherine's cabin sat tucked between two old cottonwoods, its walls built from weathered logs, silvered by years of sun and rain. A rope stretched across the porch, with a sweat-darkened saddle hanging from it. In the corner, a pair of boots stood upside down, drying from the dust. When the door swung open, the scent of warm ash and old pine drifted out a quiet greeting, not loud, but enough to remind a soul they still had a place to rest. Catherine carried Corrali over the threshold and eased her down on the edge of the only bed in the room. A simple wooden frame with a cotton mattress that had worn a hollow in its center. Corrali bit her lip, eyes darting about like a cornered animal, her hands gripping the torn fabric of her skirt. His voice came low, nearly lost beneath the whistle of wind through the gaps in the wall. Lie down. Tonight. The bed's yours. She shook her head out of habit, tried to stand, but her knees buckled. Catherine set a light hand on her shoulder, neither holding her down nor urging her forward. He simply waited until her resistance faded, then drew a thin quilt over her. The fire in the hearth cracked softly, casting small glimmers across her cheek, like the wings of a dragonfly. He moved to the kitchen. The old cast-iron pot came down from its hook and clanged onto the stove. Water hissed as soon as it touched the heat. He broke an onion in half, the knife tapping steady on the cutting board. The mild bite of onion mingled with the pepper he crushed in a mortar. Strips of dried beef went into the pot with a few chunks of potato. Without turning, he spoke just loud enough for her to hear. We won't talk much tonight. Eat, then sleep. Everything else? We'll leave for morning. She watched his broad back in the glow of the fire-straight shoulders, every motion deliberate, like a man fixing something precious. It had been a long time since anyone had handled anything for her with that kind of care. Her throat ached not from thirst, but from the sudden urge to believe. When the first bowl of soup was ready, he didn't hand it straight to her. He set it on the low wooden table, pushed it gently in her direction, then stepped back half a pace, leaving enough space that neither felt pressed. Blow on it, he said, then drink. She lifted the bowl to her lips. The scent of pepper and onion, the way the beef had come alive again in the boiling water, the salt, just right warmth that seeped from her chest outward, not just over her skin. She took a slow sip, and her heartbeat began to settle. It felt like someone had poured a thin stream of water into the dry cracks of her soul. Catherine pulled a wool blanket from a hook and spread it beside the hearth. His hat went up on a peg, and he lay on his side. Back to her a courtesy that needed no words. "I'm here, but I won't look. The bed's yours," he murmured again, eyes half closed. "If you get cold in the night." The fire's still going. She set the bowl down and looked at her hands, nails rimmed with red dust, a long scratch across her finger. She wanted to say thank you, to tell him how many days I've been walking, who chased me, who I left behind. But somehow, all those words felt unnecessary here, in this cabin. Words seemed likely to break the very silence that was mending her. Outside, the New Mexico night was thick as a black quilt stitched with 1,000 silver threads. Wind slipped through the boards, making the fire flicker like a small animal breathing slow. Corrali pulled a strip of black cloth from her pocket and wrapped it loosely around the ankle she'd scraped crossing the dry creek. He knelt to tie the knot snug, then drew his hands away without lingering, just enough to bandage the wound, just enough to steady her trembling. "Why?" Her voice finally broke the quiet, dry and faint, as if it belonged to someone else. He didn't look up, because once someone should have helped me, and they didn't. The words landed soft, but rang deep, like a stone dropped in a dry well, stirring echoes of old water. She turned toward the wall, pulled the quilt to her chin. For the first time in many nights, she didn't lie awake listening for footsteps or doors. In the steady pop of burning wood, she heard his breathing slow, even trustworthy, like the heartbeat of a house that had no name yet, but already had someone living in it. After a long while, when she thought he was asleep, Catherine spoke into the darkness, more to it than to her. "Tomorrow, if you still want to go, I'll take you to the road." A shadow of sadness crossed between his brows, but his voice stayed still and steady, like a log resting at the river's edge. "And if you want to stay, then stay." She didn't answer, just slid her hand out from under the quilt, resting it on the edge of the bed where the firelight pooled warm, small, thin fingers, but no longer trembling. On the floor, another hand rested on the wood, just far enough away that they didn't touch. But between them, silence wove an invisible thread. The night closed, with the sound of the wind changing, like someone turning to face the sunrise. In the narrow room, a quiet promise took root, not asked for, not forced, not judged, laying the first stone for a home neither had named yet. Morning in New Mexico didn't break fast. It eased in, first a thin blade of gold, slipping between the wall boards, edging the table, tracing the bed frame, then sliding into the corner of a closed eye. Corrali woke to the faint smell of coffee, rich, dark, with that soft bitterness, like a strong hand that knows when to let go. She turned her head and saw Catherine by the stove, the little tin pot, sending up lazy steam, his broad shoulders blocking most of the light from the small window. No one said good morning. Around here, morning didn't need words. Only a cup of coffee, set close enough for you to reach. He pushed the tin mug toward her, tapping the rim once with his finger, like calling her back from a dream. She wrapped both hands around it, letting the heat soak through her skin, down into the coldest parts of her. The first sip made her close her eyes. It had been a long time since the taste of morning didn't carry the weight of fear for the day ahead. Catherine stepped out onto the porch with his own cup. From the barn came the sound of a saddle creaking, a horse pawing at the packed earth. He set his cup down, walked to the corral, checked the hitch post, poured fresh water into the trough. She watched him through the doorway, man and horse standing in the new light like they'd been keeping each other company for years. On the porch, he set an old saddle on a rail and began tightening the straps. Coralie came out, hesitated, then bent to pick up a leather strap he'd dropped. "Here," she said softly. He looked at her for a second, said nothing, and let her hold one end while he threaded the other through the iron ring. He didn't ask if she knew how to tie it, didn't mention the calluses on her hands. When it was done, he gave her palm a light pat, not reassurance, not farewell, but a simple acknowledgement. "I see you here." Back inside, he pulled a couple of slices of cold bread from the cupboard, spread honey on hers, ate his plain. "This afternoon, I'm heading to the creek, see if the fish are biting," he said. "I'll go with you," she answered without thinking. He neither nodded nor shook his head, just drained the last of his coffee and fed another stick of wood to the stove. The hiss and crackle of burning pine mingled with the soft wind outside, a rhythm they both heard, like two musicians learning to match their heartbeat. For the first time, Coralie felt the cabin breathe, not just a shelter, but something alive. Its heart, the fire in the stove; its lungs, the windows, drawing in morning air; its skin, the boards holding the warmth inside. She realized she'd started to trust, not because of anything he'd said, but because the silences here no longer made her want to run. By late afternoon, sunlight poured molten gold over scattered yucca, and the wind brought with it the scent of cool water and wild grass. The ride to the creek wasn't far, but long enough for Coralie to hear each clop of hoof on stone and the deep, even breathing of Catherine beside her. At the bank, he dismounted first, tied the reins to an old cottonwood. Its bark was rough, its roots dug deep into damp earth, standing like a sentry that had weathered every season the desert could throw. Catherine pulled off his gloves, scooped a handful of water to his face. Droplets clung to the stubble on his jaw, catching the amber of the setting sun, making him look like he'd stepped out of some old tintype. Coralie knelt by the water, rolling up her sleeves. The cold was sharp enough to raise goose flesh on her arms. He came over, didn't take the water pail from her, only steadied one end, so the weight wouldn't pull her down the slick bank. "Give the chickens a drink first," he said. Not as an order, not as a question. She smiled faintly and dipped the pail again. Water splashed onto her cheeks, slid down her neck cold, but not unwelcome. When she glanced up, his eyes were on her, not prying, not asking for answers, just there, in that quiet way that said, if she wanted, he could stay beside her for a lifetime. They sat together on a flat rock, watching the creek turn copper in the dying light. From his belt, Catherine pulled a small knife and began whittling a scrap of wood into the shape of a tiny cottonwood leaf. When he was done, he handed it to her without saying, "Keep it," or "Remember this." But when her fingers closed around it, both knew it was more than just a piece of wood. The ride home was cooler, the air carrying a hint of night. Coralie balanced the water pail on her lap, listening to the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. It wasn't the ease of the trail that made her feel safe. It was the man riding alongside her. Night fell fast in the summer desert, like someone pulling a wide-brim hat low over the eyes. The wind shifted, trading its dry, sun-baked breath for the cooler notes of wood smoke and damp earth from the creek they'd left behind. Back at the cabin, firelight painted long shadows on the log walls. Catherine sat near the stove, turning a tin cup slowly in his hands. The scent of coffee mixed with pine and ash. Coralie sat opposite, turning the little wooden leaf in her fingers as if afraid it might vanish. They ate simply beans from the pot, bread softened by dipping into the broth. No one hurried. The soft clink of spoons against bowls was louder than the wind outside. After a long while, Coralie set her spoon down, eyes lowered. "I used to have a family." Catherine didn't cut in, He only leaned forward a little, the way a rider might tilt his head to catch the wind's warning. My father gambled. Too good to lose slow, too bad to win long. When he lost it all, he drank. When he drank, his hands moved faster than his mouth. Her voice stayed level, but her fingers closed tight around the little leaf. My mother left. I stayed for my little brother. He died the summer I turned 17. His death was small and quiet, like the last breath of a fire when there's no more wood. The firelight caught in Catherine's eyes, making him look like a man who'd heard more than anyone life should hold. When I left, she said, I thought I'd find a place where no one knew my name. Turns out, that place doesn't exist. Only someone willing to stay beside you can make you feel safe. He set his cup down, speaking slowly. When I came back from the war, there were nights I wish someone would ask, You doing all right? No one did. So now, I'll be here. If you need me. It wasn't a grand promise. It was like the way he gave her the bed without a word, or tied the saddle strap with her hand still holding the other end. Presence without noise. Strong enough to anchor a person. Coralie nodded, slipping the little leaf into her dress pocket, as if tucking away a piece of this night, the first in a long time, when silence didn't feel dangerous. Outside, the moon rose over the Sanger Dristo range, silver spilling through the window, laying a cool wash over them both. Inside, the fire's glow kept its promise warm. I'm here. Part 2, Living Together. In the days that followed, the little log cabin between the two cottonwoods seemed to learn how to breathe in step with the two of them. At first light, before the sun had climbed over the ridge, Catherine would already be out at the corral, her footsteps mingling with the ring of hammer on wood, the creak of a stall door, and the soft, low whicker of a horse. Coralie rose later, but soon she too was rolling up her sleeves. The moment she'd washed her face, she swept the yard, gathered dry leaves into neat piles, and stacked firewood by the porch. Catherine never told her to do it, never reminded her. Yet every so often, as he passed by, he'd place something small into her hands, a coil of rope for tying bundles, a pocket knife for peeling apples, or a woven basket for carrying vegetables. Each gift was like a quiet sentence. I trust you'll know what to do with this. By noon, they would meet in the kitchen, sharing the simplest meals, a pot of beans, a crust of bread, and sometimes a bit of meat from his short hunts. There was no need to ask, How was your day? Everything was lived out in sight of the other. He saw her planting another row of beans. She saw him mending the chicken coop roof. In the softer hours of the afternoon, they would work in the backyard. Catherine cleaned a saddle, rubbed down the leather straps. Coralie pruned tomato vines and packed the soil around the squash. Sweat beaded at her temple. And when he passed by, he didn't hand her a cloth. He simply retied the loose ribbon holding her hair, then stepped back as if he'd never touched her. Sometimes their eyes met not long, not fleeting, but just long enough to say, I know you're here. No questions, no measuring, only a silent agreement. We are living this life together. Evenings, with the fire in the stove glowing red, they sat on the porch. Catherine whittled wood, his hands steady, the blade sliding smooth as water. Coralie mended a worn shirt with a spool of thread she'd traded for at the station. The quiet was deep enough to hear the whisper of fabric and the knife's edge parting a curl of wood. Once, Catherine looked up and caught her gaze when her needle paused mid-stitch. They didn't smile, but in both pairs of eyes something had softened, like a green shoot pushing up through dry earth. Silent, but certain it would grow. Rain in that part of New Mexico was a rare guest. But when it came, it carried the weight of the whole sky. That morning, Gray clouds sank low, wrapping around the peaks of Sanger Dristo. The air changed, smelling of dry soil meeting water, of cottonwood leaves, exhaling a long-held breath. Corrali was weeding the bean rows when the first drops fell, cool and heavy. Catherine looked over from the barn and lifted a hand. She nodded, gathered her basket of vegetables, and ran for the porch. Rain drummed on the roof like 1,000 hooves pounding past. They stood together under the narrow eaves. Catherine set down his hammer, wiped his hands on his trousers, and took the basket from her. Placing it aside, sheets of white rain blurred the yard and garden until they seemed like distant memories. "Been a while since it's rained like this," he said, his voice almost lost in the downpour. "In Texas," she answered, eyes still on the yard. Rain usually meant a storm was coming. "I used to hate it." He didn't reply at once. Instead, he pulled out his pocket knife and began trimming the leaves from the tomato stalks she'd just picked, his motions unhurried, as if nothing beyond the porch could rush them now. A drop slipped from the eave onto her hand. She started to pull it back, but Catherine held out his own, catching the next bead of rain. "Here," he said softly. "Rain's what keeps the ground from breaking open. Like having someone stay beside you keeps you from breaking too." She turned to him. Their eyes met in the damp morning light. No smile, no touch, but something warm rose between them despite the cold rain. They stood that way until the downpour eased. Catherine handed her a trimmed tomato stalk. "Take it inside. Tomorrow, I'll help you plant it in the east garden. Ground'll be soft now." Her fingers brushed his as she took it, just a passing touch, enough to set her heart stirring like young leaves in spring wind. That afternoon, the earth around the cabin still breathed dampness. The air was clean and cool, each breath carrying the scent of new grass. Corrali set the washed vegetables on the table. Plump red tomatoes, small potatoes, and a bundle of herbs picked when the rain broke. Catherine came in from the yard, his shirt darkened with wet, droplets still caught in his hair. He laid a bundle of dry kindling in the corner, then paused as if listening to the knife tapping the cutting board, the fire crackling in the stove. "What's for supper?" he asked in a low voice. "Stew," she said, without looking up. "But I'm adding more vegetables." He stepped closer without a word, picked up another knife, and began peeling potatoes beside her. He worked slow and steady, choosing the smallest potato, the one usually left for the kitchen novice. Now and then, their hands brushed when both reached for the same basket. Neither pulled back, neither lingered, yet in that narrow space between them, a quiet warmth flowed. When all was ready, Catherine set the pot on the stove so she could add the vegetables. Steam fogged the window, catching the glow of firelight in their eyes as they leaned over together. "This smell," she murmured, "reminds me of the first supper I ever cooked for someone else. How long ago? Long enough that I can't remember the details, but not so long I've forgotten what it feels like to have someone waiting for me to serve it." He looked at her a moment longer than usual, not a measuring look, not pity, but the gaze of someone wanting to hold on to this moment as long as possible. By the time they sat at the table, the firelight cast their shadows on the wall. Unlike that first night, the shadows no longer stood apart. They leaned toward each other, as if drawn by the same wind. The morning of the fence repair and a wordless act of guarding. That morning, dew clung to the grass, catching the light like shards of glass. Catherine had finished checking the barn and was hauling new planks to replace the northern fence rails. Corrali came out, holding the hammer he'd left on the table the night before. "Let me help," she said, not as a request, but as a decision. They walked to the fence together. The posts here had weathered gray, some rails loosened by storm winds. Catherine braced a post while Coralie drove the nails. He didn't take her hand to guide her. didn't try to claim the hammer, just stood nearby, his body casting shade over her. As she bent to fetch more nails from the cloth bag, hoofbeats sounded in the distance. Both looked up. A lone rider on a black horse moved slowly along the trail beyond the fence. No words passed, but Catherine stepped forward, placing himself between her and the rails. His hand didn't reach for the gun, but his stance said plainly, "If you want through, you go through me first." The rider looked toward the cabin a moment, then tugged his reins and veered off. Only when the figure vanished behind the cottonwoods did Catherine step back. "Could have just been passing through," he said evenly, though his eyes stayed on the place the man had gone. Corrali kept hammering. Slower now. She knew he wouldn't ask, "Are you afraid?" because he'd already answered that by where he chose to stand. When the work was done, Catherine handed her the water bottle. Their fingers touched, and this time she didn't pull away. Her eyes said what her lips didn't. "I saw you standing there for me." He gave the smallest nod, accepting the trust she'd just placed in his hands, and walked back toward the yard, his shoulders still turned toward the trail where the stranger had disappeared. Part 3. The storm and the confession. That morning, the New Mexico sky was so clear and sharp, you might have believed nothing bad could touch it. But Catherine, with the instinct of a man who'd lived most of his life under open skies, knew better. He stood at the edge of the yard, eyes narrowing toward the horizon, where a pale gray band had begun swallowing the light. The wind shifted, carrying that damp metallic scent that meant lightning wasn't far off. The dry grass bent all at once, and the chickens scattered for the coop, as if someone had shouted, "What is it?" Corrali called from the porch, cradling a basket of fresh-picked beans. "Storm," Catherine said, his eyes never leaving the horizon, the kind that comes fast and leaves nothing alone. He grabbed the reins and headed toward the barn. "I've got to check the north fence. If the wind hits hard, those old boards will tear loose. You stay inside. Keep the fire going." She wanted to argue, but his voice was low and final, leaving no room for debate. He moved quickly, his tall frame swallowed by a sky that was already darkening. Moments later, the wind rose, lashing streaks of red dust across the porch. Black clouds rolled in, churning like a restless sea. Somewhere far off, thunder broke, a flash splitting the horizon. Corrali barred the door, but she couldn't sit still. Every slam of wind against the cabin walls made her chest tighten. She pictured Catherine out there, shoulders braced against the gusts, hands gripping a board before it could be ripped away. Then came a sound that didn't belong to the storm, the heavy crack of wood giving way, followed by a muffled groan, half swallowed by the wind. She dropped the basket on the table, wrenched the door open, and the cold wind tore at her clothes, stung her face with grit. Catherine. Her call was ripped to shreds, but her legs were already moving toward the north fence, toward the shadow she'd glimpsed through the sheets of wind and sand. The storm hit her like a wall rain mixing with dust, slanting hard. She ducked her head, shielding her eyes, forcing her way forward. Every step sank into the red mud, dragging at her skirts, but she didn't stop. Through the blur of rain, she finally saw him. Catherine hunched low, one hand gripping a fence post, the other clutching his ankle. Mud streaked his trousers, and though the wind had whipped his face raw, the pain still showed through. "Catherine," she shouted. He looked up, his pale gray eyes finding her instantly in the chaos. "I slipped. I'm fine. Fine. Nothing." "Get up." She ran to him, slipping an arm around his back. When he tried to rise, she felt the tremor in the muscles holding him upright. The wind shoved at them both, but she locked her grip, letting him lean into her. "Forget the fence. We're going home." He opened his mouth to protest, but one look at her face, equal parts fear and command, kept him silent. He let her lead. They slogged through the mud, rain coming down like it had been poured from a barrel. The porch was only yards away, but every step felt stretched thin. She bit down on her lip, feeling his weight grow heavier. "Don't you go down on me," she said, breathless. "You're the only thing I've got." It wasn't a planned confession, more like a truth the storm had shaken loose. He turned his head toward her, rain streaming over his face, and in that moment, she knew he'd heard, and he'd remember. They reached the porch. She shoved the door open, pulling him into the cabin where the scent of warm ash wrapped around them, mingling with the sharp, wet smell of rain. He collapsed into a chair, chest heaving, while she knelt to check the swelling at his ankle. Not broken, but bad. "You're not walking on it for days." He pressed his lips together, then spoke in a voice softer than the pop of the firewood. "You just said, I'm the only thing you've got." Her hand stilled on his ankle. For the first time, she met his eyes without looking away. "I didn't mean to say it now, but it's true." He didn't answer. He just lifted his rain-chilled hand to her cheek, a touch that trembled, partly from the cold, partly from something that had shifted inside them both. Outside, the rain still hammered the roof, but the wind had lost its teeth. Inside, the only sounds were the fire's crackle and the slow drip from the eaves into the bucket by the door. Corrali fetched a dry cloth. Kneeling beside him, she wiped the rain from his face, each stroke slow and careful, as if afraid to hurt something invisible. Catherine stayed still beneath her touch. When the cloth slid down to his shoulder, he caught her wrist not roughly, just enough to stop her. Their eyes held in the hush, warmed by the fire, dampened by the storm, crowded with things not yet spoken. "You didn't have to risk yourself like that," he said, his voice rough. "If I hadn't, I might have lost the only thing I have." This time, he didn't look away. His gaze burned through whatever walls she still had left. Then, slowly, he reached up, threading his fingers through the damp strands of her hair, letting a few fall across his hand. The moment wasn't ordered into being. It had simply been waiting. He leaned forward, and she didn't pull back. Their lips met, not hurried, not desperate, but like two people proving to themselves that they'd both made it here. Together, the kiss lasted long enough to say, "Thank you, don't go, and I see you." When they parted, his forehead rested against hers. "You're not alone anymore, Corrali," he said, steady as the ground beneath them. "You've got me now. Remember that?" Her mouth trembled, but from warmth now, not cold. "I'll remember." They sat there, letting the rain wash the last of the fear away. In the cabin's glow, the silence felt so full, neither wanted to break it. The storm left behind a sky scrubbed clean, but the ground was a slick of mud, and Catherine's ankle was so swollen that every step sent pain shooting up his leg. He didn't complain, but Corrali saw it in the way he leaned just a bit too much on the crutch. In the mornings, she set a bowl of hot porridge on the table before he could even get up. "Sit," she said, not as an order, but as someone determined not to let a man skip a meal. He raised a brow, but obeyed. While he ate, she pulled up a chair and unwound the bandage. The skin was less red now, though still taut with swelling. She dipped a cloth in warm water, wrung it out, and pressed it gently against the joint, eyes on her work. Catherine watched her hands that once gripped reins and now softened against his injury. "I used to look after myself," he said slowly, "but it's been a long time since anyone's looked after me like this." She didn't answer, just swapped the cloth for one warmer. For the next few days, she took over all the heavy work hauling wood, carrying water, sweeping the porch every time he tried to stand. She gave him a look sharp enough to pin him in place. "You sit still, and I'll be the one who's still calm." she told him once, catching him halfway to the chicken coop. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, Catherine carving a block of wood, Coralie mending the shirt he wore on hunts. Their eyes met now and then, not to ask questions, but to remind each other, I'm here. One cold night, she added more wood to the fire and moved her chair closer to his. Neither spoke, but the space between them had shrunk to where his hand could brush hers as they both reached for the coffee pot. By morning, the cottonwoods filtered the sunlight into shifting gold on the drying ground. The air carried the green scent of new grass. Catherine stood on the porch, leaning on his crutch, eyes on the north fence. Think I'll try walking without this today, he said. Coralie folded her arms, leaning against the porch post, her look half skeptical, half firm. You can, if I'm coming with you. He gave a rare smile, the kind she'd only seen a handful of times. They stepped down together. Catherine eased weight onto his injured foot, pain still there, but less sharp. She moved in beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, ready to catch him if needed. The path to the fence was no longer mud, just carrying the damp smell of rain. Their steps fell into rhythm, one slow, one steady, until they matched. When they reached the unfinished section, Catherine stopped, eyeing the board they'd abandoned in the storm. Shall we finish it? She nodded, stooping for the hammer. This time, when she held the plank, his hand closed over hers to steady it. The touch lasted longer than it had to, but neither pulled away. When they were done, they stood side by side, looking at the straight line of fence in the sun. Catherine turned to her. Thanks for dragging me back that day. If it happens again, I'll do it again. But let's hope it doesn't. He nodded, then unexpectedly took her hand, not tight just enough to show he wasn't speaking lightly. I remember what you said, that I'm the only thing you've got. She swallowed, holding his gaze. And now, you're the reason I want to stay. They walked back to the cabin, their hands still joined, as if it had been that way all along. Overhead, the cottonwood leaves whispered in the wind, like they knew the whole story. If you've ever walked beside someone after almost losing them and realized the space between your hands has quietly disappeared, leave a comment. I know that feeling. Part 4. Facing the Past. That afternoon, the sky over the Cottonwood Valley was a pale gray, like a thin blanket stretched over the land. The breeze was faint, just enough to set the porch lines swaying. Catherine was tightening the hinge on the barn door when the steady rhythm of hoofbeats carried in from the distance. Coralie looked up from the bean row and saw a lean man with one shoulder slightly higher than the other, riding a gray-brown horse. As he drew closer, Catherine set the hammer down and stepped toward the gate. Deacon, he called, not warm, but not cold either. Deacon swung down, boots coated in trail dust. He gave Coralie a nod before turning back to Catherine. Heard you've been keeping someone here. Figured you should know something. Catherine folded his arms. Go on. Deacon glanced toward Coralie, then lowered his voice. There's a man out of Cimarron, asking after a girl with a scar on her left knee. Says her pa used to run cards down in San Saba. Coralie froze, her hand tightening around a clump of weeds until the stems snapped. Catherine's eyes flicked to her, catching the strain in her posture. Where is he now? Heading west. Been asking plenty of folks. I didn't tell him more than to leave it be. But he didn't look the kind to quit. The air between the three of them grew heavier. Even the wind seemed to thicken as it crossed the yard. Finally, Catherine gave a short nod. Appreciate it. Deacon shrugged, but before turning back to his horse, he added, You pulled me and my kid brother out of Pecos when nobody else would. I don't forget that. Keep yourself steady. Catherine watched him ride off until the man disappeared over the rise. Then he turned back. Coralie was still in the same spot, eyes down, her whole body strung tight as a bow. He didn't ask, Is it him? He didn't ask, What do you plan to do? Instead, he walked to the rack, took down the Winchester, and set it on the table. I'll stand where you stand. Coralie lifted her head. Her eyes held no tears, only a sharp, bright edge. Then, let's not wait for him to find us. Let's go. And in that moment, Catherine knew they weren't running. They were choosing where they'd stand together. By dawn, the light was thin, muted by a veil of mist. Catherine was up first, checking the cinches, tying down the gear behind his horse. Coralie packed dried beans, a sack of cornmeal, and a small knife in a cloth bundle. They worked in silence, not the silence of doubt, but of two people fixed on the same course. Before stepping out, Coralie paused, her gaze sweeping the cabin, the table where they'd shared their meals, the porch corner where Catherine whittled, the hook where he'd hung the cottonwood leaf he'd carved for her. She took nothing but the cord around her neck, the one holding that tiny wooden leaf. The trail to the Spanish ruins wound between dry knolls and clusters of mesquite. Winter hadn't yet settled in, but the wind already bit at the skin, carrying the chill scent of mountain stone. They didn't talk much. When Catherine looked over, she was sitting straight in the saddle, her gaze forward, not shrinking from the wind's sting on her flushed cheeks. By midday, they stopped beside a dry creek. Catherine dismounted, offering his hand. This time, when their palms met, there was no cautious space between them. She let him steady her as she stepped down, and together they led the horses to drink from the shallow pools in the rock. When we get there, no one will find us, he said, watching the trickle of water. I'm not afraid of him finding me. I just want time with you. Catherine was quiet a moment. He tightened the reins, then nodded. There was no need to say me too. The road they were taking already said it. By the time the sun brushed the western ridges, the crumbling walls of the Spanish ruins came into view. Sandstone, glowing honey gold in the fading light, arched doorways broken in two, and rows of jagged columns like the worn teeth of time. Catherine led the horses into a sheltered gap in the wall where the wind eased. Coralie gathered dead wood, and Catherine struck a fire. It flared to life between the ancient stones, lighting their faces. Not a rescuer and the rescued, but two people who had chosen to hold the same ground, no matter the storm or the dark. Winter came like an old, unhurried guest who, once inside, lingered long at the ruins. The wind threaded through every crack, whispering high and thin like a broken flute. They learned quickly to seal the gaps with old burlap, straw, and mud. By day, they left their shelter under the weak sun, walking miles to collect firewood. Catherine trapped rabbits and small birds. Coralie foraged berries, careful to choose only the safe ones. Each time they returned, the smoke curling from their rough stone hearth welcomed them from afar. One morning, the north wind was so fierce, it swallowed every other sound. Catherine was mending his coat when he heard Coralie call from the arched doorway. Wind like this? Back in Texas. I'd be down in the storm cellar. Here, you sit by the fire, he said without looking up. She stepped in, carrying a small armful of wood. Her coat flared, showing the faint scar on her left knee. Catherine noticed, but didn't ask. He just set the mended coat beside the hearth and gestured. Sit. Warm up. Night fell quickly. The firelight played over the scarred walls, making it feel like they lived inside a breathing canvas. Catherine sliced rabbit into the pot, while Coralie stitched his worn canvas bag. Each stitch even. And sure, how long do you think we'll stay? She asked, eyes on her work. Until the snow melts, or until you want to leave. And if I said I wanted to stay? He set the knife down and looked her straight in the eyes. Then I'll stay. No long promise, just a simple truth. But it filled the room with a warmth that mixed with the smoke, the scent of meat, and the damp earth outside. The wind still howled. Inside, 4 hands worked quietly, building a shelter that would last longer than this winter. That afternoon, the sky dimmed faster than usual. Thick velvet clouds swallowed the sun's last gold. When Catherine stepped out to check the tack, the first snowflakes were falling small and thin, softening the sharp brown of the ground. Coralie stood in the archway, arms folded, watching each flake vanish on the stone. "I've never seen snow fall this quietly," she murmured. "Quiet outside doesn't mean quiet inside," Catherine said, still watching the distance. They went in. As the wind began to gather, the fire burned high, its glow flickering over the stone walls like an old memory. Catherine sat, his rifle leaning within reach, a habit born of winters that carried more than cold. Coralie brought 2 steaming cups of coffee, the vapor fogging the window glass. She set one before him and took the other for herself. For a while, neither drank, just let the heat seep into their hands. Outside, the snow thickened. Wind hissed through the doorway cracks. Coralie stared into the flames and asked softly, "If he comes here, what will you do?" Catherine didn't answer right away. He took a sip, set the cup down, and met her eyes. "I'll stand where you stand, no matter where that is." The words, wrapped in the sound of the wind and the scent of smoke, felt like a vow that needed no ceremony. Coralie's lips pressed together, her gaze falling to her cup, but the faint tremble there wasn't from cold. It was from holding tight to something precious. They said nothing more. Catherine took the wool blanket from the corner and draped it over her shoulders. He didn't touch her skin, but the warmth sank deep. Outside, the snow swallowed every trail. Inside, each breath, each pop from the fire, and that one line, "I'll stand where you stand," wove a tether between them, strong enough to outlast the winter. By late winter, the wind had changed its voice, less howl, more breath, carrying the scent of thawing earth. Snow melted into thin streams that trickled through the stone cracks and down to the valley. Catherine stepped to the archway, looking up at a pale sun breaking through the clouds. "It's time to head back," he said. Coralie nodded. She didn't ask back where. She packed what was left, half a sack of cornmeal, the coil of hemp, the small knife, the wool blanket worn thin at the corners. Every piece had seen them through the longest winter she could remember. They led the horses out over the stone, the clop of hooves ringing clear. The way home held no storm, but it bore winter's marks, fallen branches, scoured patches of earth. They didn't hurry. Catherine kept the pace easy, as if stretching out the last miles they'd have alone in this quiet. Halfway back, Coralie looked over her shoulder at the ruins receding into the hills. "You think? We'll remember that place." "I will," Catherine said, eyes ahead, but not for the stone or the wind, for knowing you weren't going to leave. By late afternoon, the cabin appeared through the cottonwoods. They stopped for a moment. The door was closed. No strange tracks in the yard. Catherine dismounted first, opening the latch for her. Inside, the familiar smell of wood and the thin layer of dust met them like a long breath. Let go. Coralie set her bundle on the table, brushed the dust from a shelf. Catherine unlatched the window, letting the sunlight pour in and touch the corners that had been dark for months. Neither spoke, but both felt it clearly. They'd left as companions and come back bound, closer than kin. That night, they ate hot stew by the fire. When Catherine rose to light the lamp, Coralie watched him, a small smile on her lips. The smile of someone who'd found where they belonged, after once believing they'd never have a home again. Part 5. A new season and a home. Spring didn't arrive with a fanfare. It came in on the faintest of scents, the smell of wet earth drifting through the morning breeze, the resin of cottonwoods glistening under new sunlight. The creek behind the cabin was no longer a sluggish ribbon of water. It murmured now, tumbling smooth pebbles like a child chuckling to itself. Catherine rose earlier than usual. He unlatched the window and let the first light pour in, scattering the fine dust that floated over the wooden shelves. After the long winter, the air inside smoke. Still furniture felt suddenly lighter, as if someone had dropped a pinch of sunlight into it. On the porch, his carving knife and a small plank of pine lay where he'd left them the night before, beside the tiny cottonwood leaf he had whittled a year ago. Coralie stepped out, wrapped in a thin scarf, her hair tied back, her eyes still soft from the dawn's mist. She lingered at the threshold, listening to the water's song, the restless wings of the chickens, and the sound of Catherine tapping at a loose board along the porch. "How does it sound?" she asked, half teasing, like a house ready to open its heart wider. He replied, resting his broad palm against the porch rail. That morning, they ate quickly. Day-old bread, dipped in darkened honey, strong coffee, and a few remaining apples. Then Catherine spread out a piece of smooth brown paper he'd kept since buying cornmeal in Mora. His finger traced the pencil lines he'd sketched, his eyes bright as sunlight breaking through leaves. "A new room? On the east side?" he said. "Morning light will come in from here. Thin walls, warm enough in winter. A small window facing the garden." Coralie leaned on the table, tilting her head to study the drawing. On the edge of the paper, he'd drawn a small rectangle behind the house, a chicken coop. She smiled, took the pencil, and added a scatter of tiny circles, turning them into 6 button-sized eggs, 6 hens, 1 loudmouth rooster. "Not too loud," he said, "so we can still hear each other." She meant to toss back another joke, but stopped. Her eyes caught his eyes that had weathered storms, stood through a season of stone fields, and kept her company under the crumbling arches of the Spanish ruins. Now, they shone like the creek after rain, carrying no oath yet speaking plainly. They stepped outside. Catherine measured the ground from the porch corner to where the new wall would stand. He counted under his breath, tapped a pebble into the earth to mark it, and went to fetch the handsaw hanging on a wooden peg. The handle worn smooth, but the teeth still sure, like his voice when he'd once said, "You've got me now. Remember." Coralie headed for the garden, replacing the brittle twine with fresh hemp. She dug small holes, each stroke of the hoe steady and measured, like the heartbeat of someone who's made it through anxious nights and knows she's still living, still going to live. Looking up, she saw Catherine carrying 2 long planks over his shoulder. His shadow stretched across the slanting sun like the curve of an old saddle. "I think," she called, her voice flowing like water over stone, "if we put the window here, we can see the hens and the creek." Catherine paused, adjusted the plank, and followed her pointing finger with his gaze. He nodded, marking a small notch on the edge of the wood. "All right, a window for when you want to look without stepping out. And when you do want to step out, the door will still be open." By noon, the air had warmed. The sound of sawing, hammering, the tinny ring of nails, the scrape of her hoe, the cluck of a neighbor's hen wandering over the fence, all wove into the quiet music of a working life. Not a ballad, but the low, steady score that runs beneath the best Western romances where love doesn't perform. It labors. They rested a while in the cottonwood's shade. Catherine pulled from his pocket a piece of black walnut, dark and smooth from much handling. He laid it across his knee and unfolded his pocket knife. "Something for your hand," he said softly, almost to himself, "so it's never empty again." Coralie watched. She'd seen him carve before, but this was different. The blade moving slower, each groove shallow, or deep in time with her own breathing. The wood began to show delicate circles, tightening toward the center. A bracelet, not ornate, not perfect, but every grain held the warmth of his palm. Catherine. She said his name barely above a whisper. He didn't look up, just let a faint smile touch his mouth. The kind that came when he was at peace with what he was making and kept smoothing the edge. Not finished yet, he murmured. Needs oil. Same as that room still needs walls. A roof. Your hands in it. Somewhere. A rooster crowed. A lone rider passed in the distance, raising a hand. Catherine tipped his hat without lifting his eyes from the carving. Coralie turned over a basket of seedlings on her lap. Tiny green shoots, round as words not yet spoken. By late afternoon, they began raising the frame. Catherine stood on the ladder, driving nails, while Coralie braced the post below. With each strike of the hammer, sunlight shimmered along the nail heads like stars pinned to the floor of the sky. Upright post, crossbeam, temporary wall, each piece bringing their breath into the same rhythm. Do you hear it? She asked. Breathless. The house sounds different every time we add a plank, like a horse changing its stance when someone believes in it, he answered. By sundown, half the frame was standing. Catherine opened a tin of oil, rubbing it into the bracelet. The walnut darkened, warm and smooth as sun-touched skin. He placed it in his palm and held it out. It's only wood, he said, but if you wear it, it'll remember the shape of your hand. Coralie didn't reach for it at once. She looked at the bracelet, then at him, the man who'd said, I'll stand where you stand on a snowy night. You've got me now in a storm, who'd risen early to draw a window just so she could see the creek. I'll wear it. When the room is finished, she whispered, so it and the room can start on the same day. He nodded, accepting a promise without altar or hymn, threading a length of hemp through the bracelet. He tied a loose knot and hung it on the porch nail, right beside the tiny wooden leaf from the year before. 2 pieces of wood, 2 milestones, swaying faintly in the evening breeze. They lit the fire early, the air filled with the scent of dry pine and oiled wood. In the skillet, fat hissed, onions smoked, and slices of rabbit sizzled. Coralie sprinkled salt and a pinch of creekside herbs. Catherine set 2 chipped enamel bowls on the table, waiting with the ease of ritual. They ate in silence, not from weariness, but the full silence of knowing you were exactly where you belonged, with exactly the right person. Each bite chased away a little more of the old season's chill. Afterward, Catherine hung the oil lamp, trimming the wick lower than usual. He didn't glance at her. While doing it, habit had taught him this timing. But tonight, as the warm light spread across the room, Coralie touched his arm. Thank you for always lighting it early for me. It's not early, he said, just in time, so you don't have to meet the dark alone. Outside, the night spread over the valley like black velvet. Inside, the smell of fresh-cut wood, walnut oil, onions, and clothes drying near the stove mingled into the scent of a home growing by one more room. Coralie stood in the doorway, where the future window would be just a rectangle of open air now, framed by red dust. She imagined glass, imagined hens running like white notes across the yard, imagined Catherine leaning through the sill to hand her a warm tin cup. Tomorrow, she said, we put up the top beam. Then I'll trade for glass at the station. I'll come with you. Catherine replied, saving her from having to ask. She turned. The space between them was only a breath wide. Not a kiss. Not tonight. Tonight, they gave each other tomorrow's tasks, like 2 craftsmen exchanging tools. For them, staying was the finest verb love could offer a Western kind of promise. Built into the saw, the hammer, the oil rubbed into wood. the lamp lit half a step ahead of the darky. Before bed, Catherine hung his hat beside the two wooden keepsakes. He rested a hand on the windowsill, listening to the night. Corrali pulled the blanket to the edge of the bed, then paused, whispering as though not to wake the whole valley. "I'm staying." He didn't answer in words. He stepped close, pressed a soft kiss into her hair, as light as wind through leaves, then stepped back to his bedroll on the floor, keeping the habit from the first night. A reminder that this home had begun with the choice to give each other space. The night closed in. On the porch, the leaf and the bracelet tapped together in the breeze. A sound so faint you had to hold your breath to hear it, but enough to let the wakeful know. Tomorrow, a window would open, hens would come, and a promise to stay would be set deeper still by nail, by glass, by lime, by a glance that lingered longer than one heartbeat. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the curtains earlier than usual. The creek outside chattered brighter, and somewhere, the neighbor's hen crowed 3 times in a row as if announcing the day. Corrali swung the door open, letting in the mingled scents of mist and damp earth. Catherine was already on the porch, saw in hand, eyes on the half-built frame. "Top beam goes up today?" he said, as if it were a morning greeting. "And the chicken coop," she added, stepping down, her hair loose around her face. They worked without many words. Catherine measured the high gap, passing posts down to Corrali as he climbed the ladder. Each hammer strike echoed in the crisp morning air, blending with the breeze through the cottonwoods. When the last beam was set, the frame straightened as if squaring its shoulders, ready for a roof. The coop came next. Catherine chose a spot near the creek, where water and shade met. They fitted boards, stretched wire, and hinged a small door just wide enough for hens. Corrali sketched a 4-petaled flower on a plank and nailed it above the door. "So they'll remember. This is home," she said with a smile. "Like you did," Catherine replied, his voice low and steady. By midday, they rested with water on the porch. Catherine set a small piece of wood on the table. "This afternoon, we'll trade for window glass," he said. "Pick up seed, and if we can, a few young hens." That afternoon, they rode to the station. The road was warm and dusty, clinging to boots and skirt hems. Catherine chose the clearest panes without a scratch, tying them carefully behind his saddle. Corrali found sacks of corn and bean seed and, to her delight, a cage holding 3 gold-feathered hens asleep in the sun. On the way home, they stopped at the ridge overlooking the valley. Below, their cabin nestled among the cottonwoods. Porch in sunlight, new room, stretching like an open arm, holding the cage in her lap. Corrali felt something shift. It no longer felt like a place to take shelter, but a place she had chosen. Catherine leaned over, his hand brushing her back, a gesture both protective and confirming what he'd told her long ago. "You've got me now, and always will." They rode down into the valley, the afternoon light spilling ahead, like a road already cleared for the seasons to come: planting, harvest, and the keeping of promises. That spring, the cottonwoods bloomed white as cotton itself, their fluff drifting through the air, settling in Corrali's hair like soft snow. The creek sang full all day long. Catherine drove the last fence post into the earth and looked up to see her stepping from the porch with a bouquet of wildflowers' yellow sunbursts, pale blue forget-me-nots, and a touch of white daisy. "It's a fine day," she said, her eyes bright. "Yeah, fine for marrying," he answered, half teasing, half not. She froze, then laughed. But her smile slowed when she saw he hadn't looked away. Catherine set down the hammer and stepped closer. No big ceremony, no preacher, just you and the sky to witness. They walked to the creek bank, where 2 great cottonwoods stood like gateposts. their branches meeting overhead in a green arch. The wind stirred, sending cotton blossoms drifting around them. From his pocket, Catherine drew 2 walnut rings, warm, smooth, carved over weeks from the same piece of wood, so they'd always share the same grain. Will you? I already did. The day you said you've got me now. He slid the ring onto her finger, his hand trembling, not from fear of losing her, but from knowing he was about to keep her. She slipped the other onto his, her touch pausing over the calluses shaped by reins and hammers. No vows were spoken, but the sky and the creek kept them anyway. They sat on the grass by the water, eating honey bread and drinking cold creek water in the quietest peace either had ever known. The afternoon light turned the whole valley gold, and from then on, every cottonwood breeze carried the sound of 2 voices twined together, a promise to stay. Forever, years turned, and Cottonwood Valley changed its colors through endless seasons. The field in front of the house went from spring green to summer gold, to autumn red, to winter white. The cabin had grown another room, a longer porch, to shelter them from the long rains. By the hearth, a small wooden cradle sat Catherine's handiwork, every rail smoothed, every leaf carving shaped after the trees outside. In it, a baby girl slept, tiny hands curled, her breathing as soft as winter's whisper. She had her mother's quiet eyes and her father's steady hands. Some days, Coralie stood at the window, watching her husband in the garden, his broad shoulders still as sure as the first day he'd steadied her from a fall. Without meaning to, she'd remember it all: the dry creek, the storm, the winter in the ruins, and the wedding witnessed only by the sky. Every memory carried the same taste, the moments he had chosen to stay. That night, as the fire dimmed, Catherine, as always, reached for her hand under the blanket. "I'm still here," he said. Not a promise, but a reminder. "I know," she answered, tightening her fingers around his, feeling the work-hardened lines and ridges. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, making a sound like 2 voices telling the same old story. How a girl once said, "I've got nowhere else to go," and a cowboy answered, "You've got me now, and that's enough." From that day on, neither of them ever walked alone again. A home isn't 4 walls or a roof against rain. A home is where, at your most worn down, someone opens the door for you. It's the hand that reaches for you in the storm, the eyes that wait at the end of the road. For Coralie, home was no longer a place to run from, but a place to remain. To remain because her heart wanted to, because beside her was someone who never let go. For Catherine, home wasn't just built from wood and stone, but from every kept word, every time he chose to stand by her. Past and storms be damned. Some words seem simple, yet they can change a life. Like that day in the red desert when she said, "I've got nowhere else to go." And he answered, "You've got me now, and that's enough." Since that day, every road they've walked has run parallel in the same direction. Have you ever met someone who made you believe you were no longer alone? Leave the name of your city in the comments. And if this story touched you, tell me, on a scale from 0 to 10, what it's worth to you.